people in the United States who represent what it means to grow up as a closeted gay person on streets of Dhaka and Bangladesh. I'd say three things in this debate. First, I'll talk about media and airtime and why we think we give more voices to the most underprivileged people within those movements who necessarily get ignored under side opposition. Second, I'll talk about what the process of that majority individual representing these people means in terms of misrepresentation and stereotyping, even in their best intentions. And third, I'm going to do a comparative of strategies between normalization versus pandering and why we think normalization process is much better than pandering to the white man. First of all, airtime, right? These guys say, like, this is the most off response ever, right? We need Fox News. Fox News is homophobic, right? Even if your white people who go there are going to say really shitty things about LGBT people. We don't think that's a trait, right? More importantly, we're talking about the media. We're talking about groups which often do compete against each other in order to show those kinds of causes. So we do think these kinds of organizations, CNN, if it starts doing LGBT issues, that means BBC will also have to come up with an analysis article. The Economist does it. New York Times gets competition out of it. Means that it must get a better analysis of that minority. So that competition will always exist, right? But the problem is that once they decide to go ahead and highlight this minority, they always end up deferring to these white majority people because they're already privileged and they see more of an authority. The difference here is that closing government suggests that the point at which these individuals get the platform to speak up, that they transfer that platform to sometimes the most underprivileged within those minorities who in status quo get no support, right? So even if some minorities get some voice, these are often white feminists, these are often white gay people. These are never people who are at the very bottom of that rung, and we propose that we transfer that platform to these people at the go. We think that's the differentiation closing government brings. No, thank you. So how does this then process that they go ahead and start about, right? So misrepresentation and stereotyping. Closing opposition says they will not stereotype because they have the best of intentions and these are generally nice people. That does not change the fact that they don't understand what it means, right? I might therefore go ahead and say, I really do want LGBT people to get their rights, but never understand what it means to go ahead and tell a gay person, oh, you must have really good fashion sense. That might actually be really, really negative comment for that person without me ever realizing that that might be the case because I've never been in that position. So we argue that this means that sometimes these kinds of stereotypings happen. And the point of that is that people who often don't conform to those stereotypes and representations often end up losing out because even rights given to those people are not therefore given for the purpose of those individuals, therefore they still get discriminated. Secondly, right, the thing about misrepresentation also comes here, right? So even the kinds of rights end up being fought for are people. No, like don't start standing every 2 seconds, right? We would argue that the representation you give, the point at which you try to relate, like closing opposition would argue, that's the point at which you relate with things that you yourself can relate to. What's that mean? That means as a white person, white man who wants to talk about feminism, you talk about issues you see in your office. You talk about those kinds of casual sexism without ever realizing there are perhaps bigger issues for underprivileged people. For example, accessibility to abortion, right? We never talk about that. We say abortion should be legal, but never talk about what it means for an African American woman who can't even access abortion, even if it's legal, right? So we think that's the difference in terms of not being able to fight for rights. So, best case scenario, you don't have rights for those kinds of people. Right? Finally, in terms of they're like, oh, but guys, they will represent them because they need their support. Couple of things. Often they don't, because those are people who are underprivileged, means they don't have the same amount of political capital as the people at the top of that kind of movement. Second response, we already told you, often your system eventually means these people internalize the kind of inferiorities that necessarily means these people often feel like they don't have the right or the ability to go ahead and speak up. We think those are the things that strike them down. Right? Finally, side opening opposition says, oh, but the discussion always gets speared to the important issues. That does not happen. The point at which these people can't speak up to begin with. We don't think that's a process that automatically people start thinking about these issues when no one brings it up to begin with. Then these guys are like, oh, but we'll lose support of the major allies. Those people don't do that, right? If they care, then they're going to give funding. If they care, then they're going to go ahead and join your street protests. We don't think like those people are really allies. If they're going to go like, oh, you won't let me speak? Fine, I don't support LGBT anymore, right? But finally, these guys are like, oh, but unity will be hampered. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, it's a lie to say unity exists. The point is you keep telling people that unity exists. A, that then necessarily means some things get under the rug and those rights get never materialized. B, we don't think it's a harm to say unity doesn't exist because that's a discourse, right? According to science opposition, you know, like bad discourse is still good discourse. Then there you go. If you have discussions between those kinds of movements about where they differentiate, that's still good because that kind of discussion happens. Go ahead.
If the privileged allies who support your cause don't understand your pain, how the hell are the people who oppose your cause supposed to understand your pain without you?
I'm coming to that. Normalization versus pandering. Let's deal with that. These guys say, let's say relatable things to these individuals. The point is, you set a standard. That's my second issue, by the way. You set a standard for when you can get your rights. That means, in the long run, that cyclone opposition wants to talk about, you never get the rights that you can never relate to for the majority. What do we propose instead? We think empathy can be garnered in the long run when eventually you are able to see as just another member of society. That's eventually how you get relatability and sympathy rather than otherization, like let's pity them, let's give them some rights. Eventually you also want to get the rights that you can't relate to for those people, right? So as opposed to pandering, we want normalization. We want continuously for people to see that black gay people are out there too. And that's a process, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, we agree with them, it's a long-term process. And that is why eventually you know those kinds of things, right? But furthermore, this is when that process happens, when we're able to see a white man comes up and says, I have this platform, but I will defer this platform to a member of the minority. That is what shows agency. That is when you don't see them as inferior. That is when you don't see them as an otherization, right? That is when you can start relating to these people for the first time. Because eventually you start seeing them as an equal and not an inferior member of society that you can't relate to. We think that's the critical difference. Even if in the short run, they get some things out of pandering to the majority, in the long run, these people are never normalized under the opposition's model. So for the long-term benefits, ladies and gentlemen, even if we take some short-term hits, we should go ahead with this motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, in order for the proposition bench to win this debate, they had to show us a process through which eventually this normalization takes place. Then all of a sudden, the majority you claim will never understand the minority. Even the ones that really try to will suddenly A, consider them to be equal, B, start accepting them as a part of their community given their exclusion in the first place, and then give them equal position to make those statements and somehow empathize with them. That is bullshit, ladies and gentlemen. They do not win. I'll start by engaging with the first idea of how to gain support at airtime, because that was basically all that the closing opposition talked about. First, Mubarak tells us that, you know what, Fox News and this kind of media are homophobic and centered towards majority anyway, right? We believe that the ones that currently vouch for minorities are extremely unpopular and therefore do not have the ability to generate any amount of discourse whatsoever. The viewership you have doesn't exist right now. Under your model, in the worst case scenario, assuming that these privileged allies come up with all kinds of homophobic or, let's say, really skewed viewpoints, and gentlemen, at least those viewpoints then come up into the picture of the majority, which generates interest for you to view those minority channels as well. So ladies and gentlemen, under your model, you don't get to see the underprivileged minorities anyway, ladies and gentlemen, because even under your model, they are shafted. So if you make a comparison, we at least provide that some form of exposure. Then you tell us that guess what, only the smallest of minorities will not get airtime. We believe that's not true, primarily because you need their support in order for the movement to go on anyway, because critical mass is required for political change and whatnot. Then Mubara tells us that guess what, these people cannot empathize and they don't understand because they don't have those experiences. Wasser pointed out that guess what, if people who are actively trying to understand your problems and actively trying to help you out have a hard time understanding it, we don't think your status quo is any better, where the majority has no way in which you can influence their mentality. What Wasifa's entire extension showed to you, why it's much easier if you view someone's problem from a similar prism, right? Because that majority has had similar experiences in life and therefore is much more relatable too. So they had to make that comparative, which they did not and sadly no longer can. Then we believe in Japan. Then they tell us that minorities feel inferior because they don't have voice. That minorities feel inferior because they don't have support in Japan. Because their problems are not heard at the end of the day. Just because I'm standing up in some altar or whatever and yelling up the problems with no audience, it won't make me feel any good anyway in Japan. Therefore, for them to feel like they matter, there has to be some sort of stage you put them on, and then later on they can use that stage better. The last thing that Sue talks about is relatability, and this was absolutely asserted. That if you allow them to normalize, then Mubarak and Sadiq won't yell fancy words, that somehow you won't pity them anymore and you'll accept them. The characterization setup is one where they're extremely underprivileged, one where they have no rights whatsoever right now, where no one listens to them in general, especially the minorities. We are yet extremely curious to find out how it happens. We tell you that relatability can only occur when you see their problems through a similar perspective that you can truly understand and comprehend. And that, in essence comparative, is much better and much more relatable in Japan. At the end of the day, we don't think that the characteristics of these minorities are diluted to the point that they stop existing. We think that's a status quo. Right now, you make sure that their characteristics and the similarities you have with them can be pointed out better, which is why it's easier for you to relate to them. Closing our position does not. Before I move on.
Given this absolutely extreme context of having no rights whatsoever, why should the underclass privilege then be held at ransom by the standard that is set by the privileged majority?
First, we don't think the privileged majority at this point in time will have an incentive to do that. We're yet to find out why a majority is wanting to vouch for these minorities have an incentive to actively screw them over, because that should not be in their interest anyway. Therefore, they must have some incentive to help them out, right? We don't see why that will happen. Moving now to opening government. The first and most damaging argument they come up with is that characteristics should remain immutable and people should be exclusionary. We from closing opposition told you that that's the exact problem, right? Majority believes that there will always be people whom you can never relate to, who will always remain outsiders, and we have to exclude under all circumstances, and therefore we can never opt in or opt out of even one feature that we might share with each other. That's a problem, because unless and until you can opt in and therefore vouch for them, they will never become a part of your community, and it's always easy to tell them that guess what, you are not one of us, we are different in Japan, which is why we reject the characterization where it has to be immutable. What we tell you is that we understand from our closing opposition that perhaps right now certain features will be diluted in Japan, but the dilution will only make sure that it's more palatable. Why is that trade-off worth it? Because unless and until we accept them as an active part of our community, we will not accept other features of the community at any point in time. The first step is acceptance in Japan. Once that acceptance happens, you can talk about the complete extent of that acceptance in Japan, and we believe that's exactly what we achieve. Then they tell us that ownership of the discourse should be purely on the minority. We don't think anyone owns a discourse, they own that identity. And the more support you foster from the majority in Japan, the greater the discourse becomes, because otherwise it's just a monologue, right? We believe in Japan, for that acceptance to happen, the discourse needs to proliferate to a great number of people. Sit down. But the biggest value addition from closing government, and which also responds to opening government, is about empathy. Closing opposition is about empathy in Japan. Because we told you that the best way to empathize, sit down, the best way to empathize with a minority, please sit down, is for us to be able to understand what we have in common as well. We reject that until and unless you are a homosexual yourself, you're completely unable to understand why you're different. We think we get to empathize with that too. How do we differ from the opening opposition's case? First and foremost, we analyze to you how exactly the acceptance process happens by diluting that particular but detect certain features, so their acceptance is there right now, and that can be proliferated later on in the future. Then we showed you how characteristics that are currently alien to the majority become acceptable as well, as a if you start viewing things from the prism of the majority in the first place. But lastly, we talked about why the ownership of your identity comes second to sharing certain features, that those features can be opted in by other people as well to be accepted into the broader community. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the entire proposition bench was nothing short of romantic, but didn't prove anything at the end of the day. Because of that, closing opposition takes debate. I'm extremely proud to do this.